Hiya, back virtual again. So, our studies this half term are going to be based around the US executive, and part of that is going to be a comparison to the UK executive. So what I'd like you to do first of all is a brain spill on the powers of the Prime Minister. What are the key terminology words that we would expect to be using when we're discussing this? You have 2 minutes, starting now. Okay, so let's have a look at what I've suggested you might have put down in your brain spill. I've got some suggestions there based around the royal prerogative powers. That's the central part of it. You can see in the areas of green is how his relationship is with the cabinet, both as a chair, but also setting the cabinet agenda, hiring and firing people within the cabinet, but also making smaller cabinet committees out of the cabinet itself, therefore having a great deal of control about how the cabinet works. Other royal prerogative powers, which are significant, appointing peers to the House of Lords, as we've seen recently, armed and security forces control, which is obviously very significant, but also those, I suppose, less constitutional powers, but things that almost draw the Prime Minister into being head of state, being the key UK representative in negotiations for different international groups, being the main figure in terms of media conferences, but most significantly being leader of the majority party, and the fact that that is the root of the power of the Prime Minister and the fusion of powers that exist within the UK Parliament. Why is this relevant? Well, as we look at the President, we want to be able to draw comparisons with the Prime Minister and how the centralisation of power around number 10 can maybe be equated to the way in which power revolves in Washington too. Okay, so the classic question in US politics is how powerful is the modern president? The president was set up, obviously, as the executive branch and the separation of powers. But there have been views, certainly through the 20th century, that the modern presidency has moved well beyond what the Founding Fathers expected. Schlesinger put forward the view that the power of the president is now an imperial presidency, which means that the president has moved beyond the control of the Congress. Others have challenged this. Busby talks about an imperiled presidency, the fact that actually the president has expectations well beyond their means. Neustadt talks about the power of the president being the power to persuade, purely the only ability to be like the bargainer in chief that Mervyn discussed. Skowronek talks about the battering ram that the power of the president has in terms of constitutional powers, but of course that depends on many circumstances around them. Our job is to understand these interpretations, the roots of these interpretations, and be able to argue them ourselves. So, our first question is, does the imperial presidency remain relevant today? Certainly with Trump and also with George Bush Jr., there's a lot of discussion about the return to the imperial presidency, a presidency that goes beyond the control of the oversight of Congress, especially in both foreign affairs, but maybe also seen in domestic affairs too. Our original study was on the 1990 budget with George Bush Sr. And that study by Mervyn may suggest that you'd be skeptical of this view of the imperial presidency. So here's your first exercise. Look in the 1990 budget crisis. Explain why Mervyn might be skeptical of the power and authority the president has. So use your notes and using examples, explain how any of those four, I want 2 of them please, could be relevant in describing presidential power and authority in that example. So the congressional attitudes that Bush had to face, or the media methods that he was using, including the bully pulpit, his struggles with his mandate, or public opinion through that period. So pick 2 of them and write up an explanation, please. 10 minutes. Okay, well done. This slide I created because I thought if we're going to discuss presidential power, we have to understand where it's rooted and also the constraints that they face. And I think within this slide, you probably have all the powers that you need to be aware of. As you can see in the top left-hand corner, we have formal powers, the constitutional powers, which you can find in the textbook, page 113 and 117. From controlling the government, through controlling the armed forces, to being the major figure in foreign affairs, to be the person who can actually bring people into the executive, but also the judiciary. Now, those constitutional powers are actually supplemented by what's called informal powers or direct action powers, powers that work beyond congressional oversight. These include executive orders, executive agreements, signing statements, and recess appointments, all of which you need to be aware of and can be found in the textbook between pages 147 and 151. They're at the root of the argument that the President has moved beyond their constitutional powers to become a more imperial figure. Contrasting to that, you can see in the bottom left the constitutional constraints of Congress and also the Supreme Court. Perhaps significantly, though, you have the other restrictions that the President now faces in a modern democracy. The dangers of interest group interference with policy, the importance of the media and having to respond to that, but also significantly the federal bureaucracy and state governors, the means by which you can actually control government across the whole of the United States, but you're reliant heavily on others to implement your policies. Added to this is the nature of presidential authority. This is pretty much where the argument put forward by Neustadt exists, that actually power relies on persuasion. And you can see here the two different types of authority. The aspects, the variables, if you like, that enhance authority and the variables that can undermine. If we were to take Trump, for example, he plays heavily on the symbolism of the office of him as president. He talks about his mandate from the election. He talks about the economic success that he's had as a means to try and enhance his authority. The variables against him are the difficulties he finds within Congress, the difficulties he's having with the economy and the COVID situation, and political scandals and his impeachment that kind of surrounds his administration. So as you can see there's ways in which a president can perhaps use their authority to enhance their power, but at the same time can face certain variables that make it very difficult for them to actually run their office. We'll do more about that later. Your first job is to focus on the first bit of reading. This is the article by Alex Wooden, Presidents and Leadership. Wooden takes a line that actually the president is quite restricted in what they can do, despite the enhancements of the modern presidents and the expectations that exist around it, and even powerful presidents as Roosevelt and Reagan. He puts forward the argument that it's very difficult for them to deliver on what the expectations are. And what you want to do is you want to have a read through the different sections and answer these 7 questions to allow you to have an understanding of why perhaps the president can be seen as quite restricted. That's your job for Friday. Good luck.